The workshop door slammed shut. Professor Harrison dragged the cursed engine across the metal table, its dead weight scraping against steel like fingernails on a coffin. Ben Cooper hunched deeper into his corner chair, the plastic creaking under years of patient waiting while his daughter attended night classes. Harsh fluorescent light carved shadows across his weathered face, illuminating the grease embedded beneath his fingernails and the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Well, well," Harrison's voice dripped with contempt as he circled the table like a predator. "If it isn't our local taxi, Dad." The ancient Mercedes engine sat between them, a monument to failure wrapped in decades of carbon buildup and shattered dreams. Ben's calloused thumb traced a nervous circle on his knee, then froze. The professor's pen clicked against corroded metal, each tap echoing through the empty space like a countdown. "This beauty killed 3 of Germany's finest engineers back in 1987, Harrison whispered, leaning close enough that Ben could smell his bitter cologne. "They called it impossible." Silence stretched between them, thick with challenge and unspoken history. 10 minutes, Cooper. Show me what a real mechanic can do." Ben's eyes moved across the engine's surface, recognizing something that made his chest tighten. The distinctive valve configuration, the precise angle of the intake manifold. His breath caught in his throat as muscle memory stirred after 8 years of deliberate forgetting. "Mercedes M1119 V8, he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Engine from 1987. Professor Harrison's eyebrows shot up, surprise flickering across his composed features. The pen stopped clicking. "You know this engine?" Ben pushed himself up from the chair, his knees protesting after hours of waiting. The scent of old motor oil and rust filled his nostrils as he approached the table, each step feeling like walking toward his own grave. From the classroom doorway, 15-year-old Zoe Cooper watched her father move differently. Gone was the tired shuffle of a man who cleaned offices and drove delivery trucks. His shoulders straightened, his hands steadied. She'd seen glimpses of this version of her father before, late at night when he thought she was sleeping, standing in the garage staring at something covered by a tarp. "Just heard about it somewhere," Ben muttered, but his fingers hovered over the engine block like a pianist approaching keys he'd sworn never to touch again. The metal surface told stories of high-temperature runs and catastrophic failures, patterns that spoke to him in a language he'd tried to forget. Harrison opened a manila folder, yellowed pages crackling as he turned them. "Benjamin Cooper," he read aloud, his voice cutting through the workshop's stale air. "BMW Motorsport, Formula Development Team, Lead Engine Designer." The words hit Ben like physical blows, each one a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed anonymity. "Left abruptly in 2017. Around the workshop, tools seemed to lean inward, listening. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Zoe's textbooks slipped from her hands, clattering to the concrete floor. 8 years of thinking her father was just another working-class dad crumbled in an instant. "Why did you leave?" Harrison's question hung in the air like smoke. Ben's throat worked silently, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed memories that tasted like ashes. Through the grimy windows, Millbrook's main street lay empty, streetlights casting yellow pools on cracked asphalt. This small Ohio town had been his refuge, his hiding place from a world that demanded more than he could give. Had something more important to handle? He finally managed, his voice rough with disuse and old pain. Harrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "Racing or family?" The question stripped away pretense, laying bare the choice that had defined 8 years of Ben's life. "Family," he answered without hesitation. But the word carried the weight of everything he'd sacrificed. The professor nodded slowly, filing this information away like evidence in a case. "That's exactly why I chose you for this challenge." He gestured toward the engine with theatrical flair, his movements calculated to build tension. This engine doesn't just need technical expertise, it needs someone who understands sacrifice. Ben frowned, wariness creeping up his spine like cold fingers. The workshop suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward. "What do you mean?" Harrison's eyes glittered under the harsh lights, pupils dilated with the excitement of a man about to reveal his masterpiece. "This engine came from an AMG prototype, designed for a race car driver who was also a single father." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ben's hands trembled as Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "He crashed during the final test run. His 12-year-old son was sitting in the pit lane, watching." Zoe stepped closer to the doorway, drawn by something in her father's posture that she'd never seen before. Fear mixed with recognition, like a man seeing his own ghost. "Marcus Hoffman." Harrison said the name like an incantation. "Perhaps you knew him?" The color drained from Ben's face, leaving him pale as winter moonlight. His knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the edge of the workbench to steady himself. "Marcus was my best friend." The admission hung between them like a confession at an altar. Harrison's satisfaction was palpable, thick as the motor oil that stained the concrete floor. "Marcus said this engine was cursed, that anyone who worked on it would lose someone they loved." His voice softened with mock sympathy, a predator offering comfort to wounded prey. "But I think differently. I think it's been waiting for the right person." Ben's hand moved to the engine almost without conscious thought, his palm pressing against the cold metal. Beneath his touch, he could almost feel a vibration, a heartbeat trapped in steel and aluminum. The familiar weight of precision engineering, of dreams built from metal and mathematics. 10 minutes, Harrison repeated, his voice now urgent with anticipation. "That's all I need to know if you're the one." From the doorway, Zoe finally found her voice, cutting through the tension like a sword through silk. "Dad, we should go. It's getting late." The word dad sounded different now, carrying new weight and meaning. Ben looked at his daughter, seeing not just the girl he'd raised, but the life he'd chosen over everything else. Two worlds collided in that moment, the man he'd been and the father he'd become. The engine sat between them like a time machine, offering passage back to a life he'd abandoned. "Okay," Ben said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not because you challenged me. Because of Marcus." The next morning arrived grey and cold, autumn mist clinging to Millbrook's empty streets like ghosts refusing to move on. At Murphy's Auto Repair, the usual rhythm of work was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. "Cooper!" Murphy's voice boomed across the garage, echoing off corrugated metal walls lined with calendars featuring half-dressed women and classic cars. "You've got company." Ben looked up from beneath the hood of Mrs. Henderson's Toyota Camry, oil streaking his forearms like war paint. Professor Harrison stood in the doorway, his pressed suit and polished shoes completely out of place among the hydraulic lifts and tire irons. Sunlight streaming through dirty windows caught the dust motes dancing between them, creating a halo effect around the professor's silver hair. "What are you doing here?" Ben wiped his hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades, leaving dark smears on the faded fabric. Harrison surveyed the garage with the calculating gaze of a man appraising territory he intended to claim. "Continuing our conversation from last night." His eyes took in the ancient equipment, the oil-stained concrete, the dreams deferred, and ambitions downsized. "Impressive operation you have here, though hardly suitable for someone with your talents." Murphy's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline, confusion and curiosity warring on his weathered features. "Talents? Cooper's good with engines, sure, but he used to design powertrains for Formula One." Harrison interrupted, his words dropping into the garage like grenades into a foxhole. The garage fell silent except for the steady drip of antifreeze from a radiator in the corner. Tony Ricci, the oldest mechanic on staff, stopped mid-wrench on a brake job, his arthritic hands frozen in place. Jake Morrison looked up from an oil change, black liquid dripping forgotten from his funnel. The very air seemed to thicken with disbelief and dawning understanding. "Bullshit!" Murphy laughed, but the sound was hollow, uncertain. "Cooper, tell him he's nuts." Ben said nothing, his attention focused on cleaning his hands with methodical precision, as if the task required all his concentration. Each finger received equal attention, the ritual buying him time to think, to breathe, to decide how much truth this moment could bear. Harrison opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, extracting documents that looked official and expensive. "BMW Motorsport," he continued, reading from what appeared to be a personnel file. "Responsible for 3 championship-winning engines between 2014 and 2016. The papers rustled like autumn leaves as he turned pages, each document another piece of evidence in a case Ben had hoped was sealed forever. Technical director. Salary in the high 6 figures. Left everything behind in 2017. Tony's wrench clattered to the concrete floor, the metallic ring echoing through the stunned silence. Murphy's face cycled through emotions like traffic lights, disbelief to understanding to something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "Is it true, Ben?" The question came from Jake, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years they'd worked side by side, sharing coffee from the same pot, complaining about the same customers, and Jake had never suspected he was working alongside automotive royalty. Ben finally looked up from his hands, meeting their stares with eyes that held too much history. "Was," he said simply. "Not anymore." The distinction felt important, a line drawn in the sand between past and present. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel them slipping away like water through his fingers. Harrison smiled, sensing victory in Ben's reluctance to completely deny his former life. "Why hide it?" Tony pressed, his Brooklyn accent thickening with emotion. 3 years, Ben. 3 years we've been working together and you never said nothing." The hurt in his voice was raw, genuine. The pain of discovering that someone you thought you knew was actually a stranger. Ben looked around the garage at faces that had become familiar, men who had accepted him without question, who had become something like family in the way that shared work and mutual respect can create bonds. "Because the past doesn't define who I am now," he said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded like excuses. "Only what I do today matters." Harrison sensed the moment like a shark detecting blood in the water. But what if the past could inform the future? He moved closer to Ben, his expensive shoes clicking on concrete, stained with 40 years of automotive fluids. What if hiding your talents isn't protecting your family, but limiting their possibilities? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Ben had convinced himself was true. Murphy stepped between them, his loyalty to his employee warring with his curiosity about this revelation. "Now hold on just a minute. Cooper's got a contract here, responsibilities." But his voice lacked conviction, and they all heard it. "Responsibilities?" Harrison's laugh was cultured, condescending, the sound of someone who had never worried about making rent or stretching grocery money until payday. "Oil changes and brake replacements? Is that really the best use of one of the most brilliant automotive minds of his generation?" The words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. Ben felt the eyes of his co-workers on him, measuring him against this new information, trying to reconcile the man they knew with the genius they were learning about. "I need time to think," Ben said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his head. 24 hours seemed both too long and not nearly enough time to process everything that was changing around him. That evening, the Cooper household felt different, charged with unspoken questions and half-revealed truths. Zoe sat at the kitchen table, homework spread before her like a paper landscape. But her attention was focused on her father moving around their small kitchen with mechanical precision. He prepared dinner with the same methodical care he brought to engine repair, measuring, timing, adjusting until everything worked in perfect harmony. The spaghetti sauce bubbled on the stove, filling the room with the scent of garlic and oregano, normal sounds and smells that somehow felt inadequate to the moment. "Dad?" Zoe said carefully, testing the weight of the word in this new reality. "People at school are asking questions." Ben's stirring slowed but didn't stop, his focus remaining on the wooden spoon moving through red sauce in slow, hypnotic circles. "What kind of questions?" His voice carried the forced calm of a man walking across thin ice, each word chosen carefully to avoid cracks that might spread and shatter everything. "About you. About who you used to be." She paused, gathering courage for the question that had been burning in her chest since the previous night. "Were you really famous? Like, actually famous?" The spoon clinked against the pot's rim as Ben set it aside, finally turning to face his daughter. In her eyes, he saw curiosity mixed with something that might have been pride, and it nearly broke his heart. "Fame is just noise, Zoe. Family is what matters." The answer was true, but incomplete, a partial confession that satisfied neither of them. She leaned forward, pressing her advantage like a prosecutor sensing weakness in a witness. "But what if you could have both?" The question struck him like lightning, illuminating possibilities he'd trained himself not to see. Through the kitchen window, Millbrook's quiet streets stretched away toward horizons that had once seemed limitless. His phone buzzed against the counter, the vibration unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he checked the message. "Your daughter deserves to know who her father really is." H. The words glowed on the screen like accusations. Ben deleted the message quickly, but not before Zoe caught a glimpse of his expression. "Who was that?" Her voice carried new wariness, the instinctive caution of a teenager learning that adults she trusted might have more secrets than she'd imagined. "Nobody important." Ben lied, but the words felt heavy as stones in his mouth. That night, sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of roaring engines and checkered flags, of a life where precision mattered more than presence, where success was measured in milliseconds and championship points rather than bedtime stories and homework help. The next morning brought an envelope on Ben's workstation, cream-colored paper that looked expensive against the oil-stained wood. Inside, letterhead that made his hands shake. BMW Motorsport, Munich. The job offer was everything Harrison had promised and more. Lead engineer position, salary that dwarfed his current income by 10 times, opportunity to work on cutting-edge technology that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. "Came by courier this morning," Murphy said behind him, his voice carefully neutral. "Guy said it was urgent." The paper felt heavy between Ben's fingers, weighted with possibilities and complications in equal measure. Every word was a doorway back to his former life, every sentence a step away from the man he'd become. He crumpled the letter slowly, watching expensive paper compress into a ball that fit in his palm. But even as he threw it into the waste bin beside his workstation, the words remained burned into his memory. Lead engineer. Munich. 6 figures. The life he'd walked away from, offered back to him like a second chance at salvation. "Ben." Murphy's voice was softer now, tinged with something that might have been understanding. "Maybe you should consider it." The words felt like benediction and betrayal simultaneously. "Why?" Ben asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Because maybe I've been selfish, keeping you here when you could be changing the world. Murphy's admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Could be what? An absent father flying around the world? Rich but never home for the things that matter? But even as Ben spoke the words, he could hear their defensive edge, the sound of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Murphy nodded toward the crumpled offer letter, now resting among coffee filters and sandwich wrappers. Or giving your daughter opportunities you never had. College tuition, security, a future that doesn't depend on whether Murphy's auto stays afloat for another year. The phone call came at 3:15, interrupting Ben's work on a transmission that had been giving him trouble all morning. School, his least favorite words in any language, especially when delivered by a principal secretary with barely concealed urgency. Mr. Cooper, there's been a situation with Zoe. Could you come in? The drive to Millbrook High took 8 minutes, but felt like 8 hours. Traffic lights conspiring against him, every pedestrian moving with deliberate slowness. The school's hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage anxiety, fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly yellow hues that made even healthy faces look jaundiced. Principal Davidson's office was a beige nightmare, motivational posters fighting a losing battle against institutional despair. Zoe sat in one of 2 chairs facing the desk, her shoulders curved inward like a parenthesis around her pain. Tear tracks marked her cheeks, and her usual confident posture had collapsed into something small and vulnerable. What happened? Ben asked, moving to her side with the automatic response of a parent whose child was hurting. Davidson cleared his throat, shuffling papers with the efficiency of a man who'd handled too many of these situations to count. There was an incident during lunch period. Some students were questioning Zoe's claims about your background. The words hit Ben like a punch to the solar plexus. Zoe looked up at him with eyes that held confusion and hurt in equal measure. They said I was lying about you. That you couldn't really be a famous engineer because we're... She paused, searching for words that wouldn't hurt as much. Because we don't live like rich people. The truth of it stung because it was accurate. Their small ranch house with its single bathroom and 20-year-old appliances didn't exactly scream success. His 10-year-old pickup truck with the rattling exhaust and duct-taped seat wasn't the ride of automotive royalty. They shopped at Walmart and clipped coupons, worried about dental bills and whether the water heater would make it through another winter. They showed me pictures on their phones. Zoe continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Real engineers, in nice suits, driving expensive cars, living in mansions. She looked up at him with questions that cut deeper than accusations. Why don't we have those things, Dad? If you were really so good, why do we live like this? Principal Davidson watched the exchange with the uncomfortable expression of a man witnessing a private family moment that happened to occur in his office. Ben knelt beside his daughter's chair, his knee protesting the movement, but his need to be at her level overriding physical discomfort. Because I chose you over everything else, he said simply, the words carrying 8 years of conviction and growing doubt. But what if choosing me made you smaller? The question was barely audible, but it exploded in Ben's chest like a grenade. This was his worst fear realized, that Zoe would someday see his sacrifice not as love, but as limitation, his choice not as devotion, but as failure. He had no answer that wouldn't sound like excuses or platitudes, no way to explain that success meant different things to different people without sounding like a man trying to rationalize his own diminished circumstances. The silence stretched between them, filled with 15 years of love and 8 years of questions that were only now being asked. That night, Ben stood in his garage like a penitent before an altar, staring at the tarp-covered shape that dominated the space like a sleeping giant. For 8 years, he'd maintained the 1990 Mercedes 500 SL without driving it, changing fluids and charging the battery with the devotion of a monk tending a shrine. Anna's car. The last tangible connection to the woman who'd understood his dreams and supported his choices, who'd made him promise to choose their daughter above all else, if the choice ever came. His hand shook as he grasped the corner of the tarp, the canvas rough against his palm like an accusation. The car emerged from its shroud like a ghost materializing in moonlight, silver paint still perfect despite years of hiding. The M119 V8 engine sat beneath the hood like a sleeping heart, every component maintained to factory specifications despite never being asked to perform. Anna had called this engine pure poetry in motion, had understood the artistry hidden in its technical precision. She'd supported his racing career even when it meant lonely nights and missed dinners, had believed that following his passion made him a better father during the time he was home. But cancer had stolen her before they could discover whether she was right. His phone rang, jarring him from memories that tasted like regret and possibility in equal measure. Harrison's name appeared on the screen like a summons from his former life. Heard about the school incident? The professor's voice was smooth as expensive whiskey, sympathetic in a way that felt calculated. Small towns have big mouths. Ben didn't ask how Harrison had learned about Zoe's humiliation so quickly. The professor seemed to have sources everywhere, tentacles that reached into corners Ben hadn't known existed. Kids can be cruel when they smell weakness, Harrison continued, his words chosen with surgical precision to find and probe the deepest wounds. What do you want? Ben's voice was rough with exhaustion and growing anger. He was tired of being manipulated, tired of having his life dissected by a man who treated human emotions like variables in an equation. Your daughter is questioning things, isn't she? Harrison's satisfaction was audible across the digital connection. Wondering if your sacrifice was worth it. Wondering if love looks like limitation when viewed from the outside. Each word was a stiletto between the ribs, sharp and precise, and designed to cause maximum damage. Tomorrow night, Cooper, fix that engine. Prove to yourself and to her who you really are. The university workshop waited like a stage set for a drama. Ben wasn't sure he wanted to perform. He arrived carrying his toolbox, the leather case worn smooth by years of use, but containing instruments worth more than most people's annual salaries. Precision micrometers. Torque wrenches calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Digital calipers that could detect variations invisible to the human eye. Tools of a trade he'd abandoned, but never forgotten. Implements of precision that felt familiar as old friends in his hands. Harrison was waiting, but he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside the professor, elegant in the way that money and education could create, her silver hair styled with casual perfection. She looked familiar in a way that made Ben's stomach drop, recognition dawning like sunrise over a battlefield. "Hello, Benjamin," she said, her voice carrying 8 years of grief and carefully maintained composure. Linda Hoffman, Marcus's widow. The woman who'd buried her husband and raised their son alone while Ben hid from the world and his own guilt. Her presence transformed the workshop from a simple room into a courtroom where Ben was both defendant and judge. "Surprise," Harrison said, with the satisfaction of a man revealing his masterpiece. "I thought you should meet the real stakeholder in tonight's challenge." The word stakeholder was loaded with meaning, carrying implications of ownership and investment that went far beyond simple curiosity. Ben felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, certainties crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. "Linda, what are you doing here?" His voice was barely above a whisper, all the confidence he'd built over 8 years of careful anonymity evaporating in the face of his past made manifest. She looked at him with eyes that held pain but not blame, grief but not accusation. "Getting closure," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. "That engine killed my husband. Professor Harrison thinks you might be able to fix it." The word fix carried weight that had nothing to do with mechanical repair, implications that went deeper than carburetor settings and timing adjustments. This wasn't about restoring function to a broken machine. This was about healing wounds that had festered for 8 years, about confronting truths that both of them had spent nearly a decade avoiding. Ben looked between Linda and Harrison, understanding dawning like light through stained glass, complex and colored by emotions he wasn't prepared to feel. This isn't really about an engineering challenge, is it? The question was rhetorical. He already knew the answer in his bones, in the way his hands had recognized the engine's configuration despite years of deliberate forgetting. Harrison stepped forward like a prosecutor approaching a hostile witness, his movements calculated to maintain control of the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. "Marcus's crash wasn't mechanical failure, Ben. You know that as well as anyone." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying the scent of old guilt and older friendships burned to ash by time and circumstance. "The engine was perfect," Ben said slowly, memory flooding back like water through a broken dam. "I designed it myself, double-checked every specification, tested every component." His voice grew stronger as technical certainty overrode emotional confusion, the engineer in him reasserting control over the man who'd spent 8 years running from his own expertise. "Then why did he crash?" Linda's voice was sharp as broken glass, cutting through his certainty with the precision of surgical steel. The question was simple, but the answer was complex as grief itself, tangled with choices and timing and the terrible weight of being human in a world that demanded perfection. Ben closed his eyes, letting himself remember that day for the first time in 8 years. The smell of hot rubber and racing fuel, the sound of engines being pushed beyond their design limits, the excitement and terror that came with testing the boundaries of what was possible. "Because I wasn't there that day," he said finally, the admission feeling like a confession at a deathbed. "Marcus asked me to supervise the final test. I said no." The workshop fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic. On streets that seemed suddenly very far away, even the dust motes seemed to hang motionless in the still air, waiting for the rest of the story. "Trim." Linda's voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of 8 years of wondering, 8 years of questions that had no good answers. Ben opened his eyes, looking at her with the expression of a man who'd carried this burden so long it had become part of his skeleton, weight distributed through bones and sinew until it was indistinguishable from himself. "Because Anna had just died. Zoe needed me home." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth, honest but inadequate, true but incomplete. "I chose my grieving family over work. Marcus died because I wasn't there to catch the fuel line issue." Linda stepped closer, her composure cracking like ice under spring sun. "Fuel line issue?" The technical term sounded foreign in her mouth, a piece of engineering jargon that had somehow become the pivotal detail in her husband's death. Ben's hands moved unconsciously, tracing the path of fuel lines in the air as he spoke, muscle memory making the invisible visible. "Microleak in the high-pressure system. Would have been obvious to me, but Marcus trusted the junior engineer's assessment." His voice broke slightly on his dead friend's name, 8 years of suppressed grief threatening to overwhelm the careful control he'd built around his emotions. "If I had been there," he began, but Linda finished the sentence with the terrible certainty of someone who'd run this scenario through her mind 10,000 times. He'd still be alive. The words hung between them like a bridge over an abyss, connecting two people who'd been changed forever by a single moment of absent expertise. Yes, Ben whispered, the admission feeling like the final nail in a coffin he'd been building for 8 years. Harrison cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence, of the larger drama he'd orchestrated around their private pain. "There's more, Linda," the professor said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man revealing the final piece of a complex puzzle. "Tell him about the letter." Linda reached into her purse with hands that trembled slightly, extracting an envelope worn soft by repeated handling. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind of stationery that suggested important words, deserving of important presentation. "Marcus wrote this the night before the test," she said, extending it toward Ben like an offering or a weapon. He couldn't tell which. "I think you should read it." Ben's hands shook as he accepted the envelope, Marcus's handwriting on the address line as familiar as his own. Inside, words that reached across 8 years of silence. "Ben, if something happens tomorrow, know it's not your fault. I pushed the test date up because I wanted to surprise Charlie on his birthday. I knew you couldn't make it because Anna just passed and Zoe needs you. I made the choice to proceed without you because I understand what family means now. You taught me that. Don't blame yourself if things go wrong. You showed me that being a good father means being present. Marcus." The letter fluttered to the concrete floor as Ben's grip failed. 8 years of carefully constructed guilt, crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. "He knew," Linda said softly, her voice thick with tears that had been waiting 8 years to fall. "He knew the risk. He chose to proceed anyway because you taught him what really mattered." The workshop spun around Ben like a carnival ride, reality reorganizing itself around this new information. Marcus hadn't died because of Ben's absence. He'd died making the same choice Ben had made, putting family before career, love before ambition. "But there's more," Harrison said, his voice cutting through Ben's stunned silence like a scalpel through skin. "Linda, tell him about the engine analysis." Linda took a shaky breath, gathering herself for another revelation that would reshape everything Ben thought he knew about that terrible day. "After the crash, I had the engine sealed away. Couldn't bear to see it destroyed. Couldn't bear to have it repaired." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. 8 years of grief transforming into something harder, more determined. "But last month, Charlie, he's 20 now, asked to see it. Wanted to understand what killed his father." The mention of Marcus's son brought the tragedy into sharp focus, reminding them that this wasn't just about engineering failures and professional guilt, but about a boy who'd grown up without a father, about a family shattered by a moment of mechanical malfunction and human error. "We had the wreckage reanalyzed using modern techniques," Linda continued, her words measured and precise as a coroner's report. "Computer modeling, stress analysis, metallurgical examination. Technologies that didn't exist 8 years ago." Ben felt his world tilting on its axis, certainties he'd built his guilt upon beginning to shift like tectonic plates beneath his feet. "The fuel leak didn't cause the crash," she said simply, the words detonating in the silence like bombs in a cathedral. "What?" The word escaped Ben's lips as a whisper, but it carried the weight of 8 years of assumed responsibility, 8 years of carrying guilt that might not have been his to carry. Harrison stepped forward, papers rustling as he consulted what appeared to be an official report. The telemetry data was reanalyzed last year using artificial intelligence pattern recognition. The leak occurred after impact, not before. Each word was another chisel strike against the monument of guilt Ben had erected in his own heart, another crack in the foundation of everything he'd believed about that day. "Then what caused—" he began, but Linda interrupted with the terrible simplicity of truth finally spoken aloud. "Driver error," she said, the words falling between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything they thought they understood. Marcus was distracted. A phone call came in right before the test run, from Charlie's school. Charlie was 12, being bullied, sitting in the principal's office crying for his dad. The image was vivid and heartbreaking. A boy needing his father, a father torn between professional obligations and parental love, a split second of divided attention that changed everything. Ben felt the world reorganizing itself around this new reality, guilt shifting from his shoulders to settle somewhere else entirely, or perhaps evaporating altogether like steam from an overheated engine. Marcus faced the same choice you face every day. Linda continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Be present for your child or pursue your career. In that moment, hearing his son crying over the radio, he chose to be a father, lost focus for just an instant, and crashed. Ben finished, the words tasting different now, carrying tragedy but not blame, sadness but not the crushing weight of responsibility he'd carried for 8 years. The engine sat between them like a monument to misunderstanding, a mechanical shrine to guilt that had been misdirected from the beginning. The engine was perfect, Ben. Always was, exactly as you designed it. Linda's words were absolution offered freely, forgiveness he hadn't known he needed for sins he'd never actually committed. Harrison stepped forward, sensing the moment like a conductor raising his baton before the crescendo. So now you understand the real challenge. This isn't about mechanical repair. It's about whether you can forgive yourself for making the right choice. The workshop door opened with a squeal of protesting hinges, admitting figures that transformed the space from a place of private reckoning to a stage for family drama. "Dad?" Zoe's voice cut through the heavy atmosphere like a blade through silk, young and uncertain, but carrying the strength that came from refusing to be left out of important moments. Behind her came a young man with Marcus's eyes, but Linda's gentle mouth, 20 years old and carrying himself with the careful composure of someone who'd learned early that the world could change in an instant. "How did you get here?" Ben asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the satisfied expression on Harrison's face. "I called them," Linda said simply. "They deserved to witness this." The word witness carried religious connotations, suggesting that what was about to happen was sacramental, transformative in ways that went beyond simple mechanical repair. Charlie stepped forward with the awkward grace of young adulthood, extending his hand toward Ben with formal politeness that barely concealed deeper emotions. "Mr. Cooper, I'm Charlie Hoffman. My dad talked about you constantly." The handshake was firm, calloused from work despite his youth, and Ben could see Marcus in the set of his shoulders, the directness of his gaze. He said you were the best engineer he'd ever known, but more importantly, you were the best father. The words hit Ben like lightning, illuminating corners of his past he'd forgotten existed. Marcus had spoken about him as a father, had seen something in Ben's choices that Ben himself had lost sight of over 8 years of doubt and diminished expectations. Zoe moved to her father's side, her presence grounding him in the moment, reminding him that whatever happened next, she was still the center of his universe, the reason for every choice he'd made since Anna died. "Dad," Zoe said, her voice carrying new understanding. "I heard everything from outside." Her admission hung in the air like smoke, evidence of teenage determination to understand adult complications, whether or not adults wanted them understood. "You chose me over everything, even over saving your friend." The simplicity of her statement belied its complexity. She understood, at 15, nuances of choice and consequence that had taken Ben 8 years to fully grasp. Yes, he said simply, because there was no point in pretending otherwise, no value in protecting her from truths she'd already discovered for herself. And he chose his son, too, in the end, she continued, nodding toward Charlie with the instinctive recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be chosen, to be the reason someone walked away from greatness. Ben nodded, tears threatening for the first time in years, not from grief, but from something approaching peace. Then fix it, Zoe said, her voice carrying authority that seemed too large for her 15-year-old frame. Fix it for both of us. Show us that choosing family doesn't mean failing at everything else. The challenge in her voice was different from Harrison's, not manipulation or academic exercise, but the simple request of a daughter who wanted to see her father whole again. Ben approached the engine with hands that no longer trembled, muscle memory taking control as conscious thought stepped aside. This was what he was built for, what years of training and natural aptitude had prepared him to do. His fingers moved over the components, with the confidence of a pianist returning to a favorite piece, recognizing patterns and relationships that existed below the level of conscious analysis. Carburetor float adjustment, timing chain tension, fuel injection pressure calibration. Each task was a conversation with Marcus's ghost, a way of honoring both their friendship and their shared understanding of what mattered most. The work took 8 minutes, not 10, his hands moving with precision he'd thought lost to years of oil changes and brake replacements. But mechanical skill, like muscle memory, never really disappeared. It just waited for the right moment to reassert itself. When he stepped back, the engine looked different somehow, not just repaired but restored, not just functional, but somehow alive again. "Try it," he whispered, the words carrying 8 years of hope and fear in equal measure. Harrison turned the key with theatrical flourish, and the engine responded with a roar that filled the workshop like thunder, like applause, like absolution given mechanical form. In that sound, Ben heard forgiveness, not just from Marcus, but from himself. The engine that had killed his best friend was perfect again, proof that sometimes the only thing broken was perspective. The only thing that needed fixing was understanding. Linda was crying openly now. 8 years of grief finally finding release in the sound of her husband's last project, running exactly as he'd intended. Charlie stood transfixed, hearing his father's voice in the mechanical harmony of perfectly tuned components working in concert. Zoe smiled with pride that had nothing to do with engineering expertise and everything to do with watching her father remember who he was beneath the layers of guilt and diminished expectations. 1 week later, Murphy's auto repair buzzed with energy that had been missing for years, conversations that went beyond weather and sports to touch on possibilities and futures that had seemed impossible just days before. The phone rang constantly now, word spreading through networks Ben had forgotten existed, racing teams and custom shops calling about projects that would challenge him in ways he'd thought he'd never experience again. "Ben," Murphy said, approaching his workstation where he was installing a performance exhaust system that actually deserved the name. "We need to talk." His voice carried excitement barely contained beneath its surface calm. Ben straightened, wiping his hands on a shop rag that was somehow cleaner than usual, as if even the small details of his work had been elevated by recent revelations. Around the garage, Tony and Jake worked with renewed energy, pride in their association with someone whose talents they were only beginning to understand. The local newspaper lay open on Murphy's desk, front-page story featuring a photograph of Ben standing beside the restored Mercedes engine, looking like a man who'd finally stopped running from himself. "I know what you're thinking," Ben said, anticipating Murphy's suggestion that he take the BMW offer, return to Munich and the life he'd abandoned. Actually, no, Murphy replied, his grin infectious in a way that transformed his weathered features. I've been thinking the opposite. He pulled out a business plan that looked official and expensive, pages of financial projections and market analysis that suggested serious thought and professional consultation. Murphy & Cooper Precision Motors, custom engine development, restoration work, performance modifications. The kind of projects that use your actual skills instead of wasting them on oil changes and brake pads. The proposal was everything Ben had dreamed of during long nights in his garage, staring at Anna's car and wondering what might have been. The partnership transformed not just their business, but the entire dynamic of their small corner of Millbrook's automotive ecosystem. Within months, they were handling projects that attracted attention from across the Midwest. Vintage racers brought back to life, custom engines built for clients who understood the difference between transportation and mechanical art. Charlie Hoffman became a regular presence in the shop, completing his senior engineering thesis under Ben's guidance, while learning practical skills that no university could teach. The project was his father's half-finished engine design, brought to completion through the collaboration of mentor and student, past and future finding common ground in precisely machined metal and mathematical perfection. "You know," Charlie said one Saturday afternoon as they calibrated fuel injection parameters, "working on this makes me understand Dad better than I ever did when he was alive." His hands moved with growing confidence over components that represented months of patient instruction, natural aptitude guided by hard-won expertise. Ben watched him work and saw Marcus in the set of his shoulders, the way he approached problems with methodical persistence rather than flashy intuition. He used to say that engines were just metal and mathematics until someone cared enough to make them sing. The poetry in the statement would have seemed out of place coming from anyone else, but Charlie had inherited his father's ability to find art in engineering, beauty in function. The Mercedes 500 SL sat in Ben's garage like a bridge between worlds, no longer covered by tarps, but gleaming under fluorescent lights, maintained not as a shrine, but as a celebration of life lived fully. Saturday drives had become tradition, Ben and Zoe exploring country roads that curved through Ohio farmland, the M119 V8 engine providing soundtrack to conversations that ranged from college plans to career possibilities to the complex mathematics of choosing between security and dreams. "Are you happy, Dad?" Zoe asked one afternoon as they paused at a roadside stand to buy apples from a farmer who recognized quality when he saw it, commenting on the car's condition with the appreciation of someone who understood the value of maintaining things properly. "Getting there," Ben replied honestly, because happiness seemed too simple a word for the complex satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that had depth, and the growing understanding that success could be measured in more than money or fame. Zoe had been accepted to MIT for engineering, but deferred for a year to help launch the racing development division, her choice made not from lack of ambition, but from understanding that sometimes the best education came from working alongside someone who'd mastered their craft through decades of practice and failure and eventual wisdom. Her decision proved she'd inherited not just Ben's analytical mind, but his understanding of what mattered most. The old warehouse on the edge of town had been transformed into something that looked like the future. Precision equipment installed alongside tools that belonged in museums, past and present working in harmony to create possibilities that neither could achieve alone. Murphy & Cooper Racing Development announced itself in letters designed to suggest speed and precision, the kind of sign that attracted attention from people who understood the difference between mere horsepower and actual performance. Ben stood in the doorway at closing time, surveying the space that represented everything he'd thought lost forever, restored not through compromise, but through the understanding that evolution was different from abandonment. His phone buzzed with a text from BMW Munich. Offer still stands. We need you. The message glowed on the screen for a moment before Ben deleted it without reading the details, the gesture automatic as breathing. Another message arrived immediately, this one from a local IndyCar team. Ready to test first engine Monday? Ben typed his response with fingers that no longer hesitated over such decisions. Monday morning. My shop. My terms. Family first always. The response felt like a declaration of independence, a statement of values that had taken 43 years and considerable pain to fully understand. As autumn faded into winter, the rhythm of their new life settled into patterns that felt both familiar and revolutionary. Mornings began early, Ben and Zoe sharing coffee and conversation before she headed to classes and he to work, that challenged him in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Evenings often found them in the garage, working on projects that ranged from homework to engine rebuilds, the space filling with sounds of productive activity and comfortable silence. Linda and Charlie had become regular dinner guests, their Saturday visits creating a chosen family that honored the past while building toward a future none of them could have imagined just months before. You know what I think? Zoe said one evening as they worked together on calibrating a fuel injection system for a client's vintage Porsche, her hands steady as she adjusted settings that required precision measured in thousandths of an inch. I think Mom would have loved seeing this. The comment was casual, offered without the weight of grief that such statements had carried for years, spoken with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned that love didn't end with death, that the best way to honor someone's memory was to live fully in their absence. Ben looked up from his calculations, seeing Anna in Zoe's profile, her mother's determination combined with mechanical aptitude she'd inherited from him. She always said the best gift parents could give their children was showing them it was possible to choose happiness over security, meaning over money. The words felt true in a way they hadn't for years, not because circumstances had changed, but because understanding had evolved. Success wasn't about choosing between family and career. It was about creating a life where both could thrive authentically, where talents served the people you loved most rather than competing with them for attention and energy. The engine they were working on hummed with perfect harmony, each component doing exactly what it was designed to do. Mechanical poetry written in steel and precision. Outside, snow began to fall on Millbrook's quiet streets, covering everything in white that made familiar landscapes look new again. Inside the garage, father and daughter worked by lamplight, their hands moving with shared competence over machinery that represented not just transportation, but transformation, not just function, but the complex beauty of systems working in perfect harmony. The sound of their conversation mixed with the whisper of tools on metal, creating a soundtrack that spoke of work worth doing, relationships worth cherishing, and the quiet satisfaction that came from finally understanding that the best engine repairs often had nothing to do with engines at all. In the distance, church bells marked the hour with bronze voices that had been calling this community to attention for over a century, their sound carrying across streets where families were settling in for the night, where children were being tucked into beds, where parents were making choices about what mattered most. Ben listened to those bells and heard something he'd been deaf to for 8 years, the sound of home, of belonging, of a life that fit him as perfectly as precision tools fit his calloused hands. The engine of his heart hummed in perfect tune, all its components finally working exactly as they'd been designed to do.